I so I've been thinking about why the Biden administration has made the decisions that it's made on this war. Decisions that seem to me to have been disastrous and catastrophic, not just for the people in Gaza, although that's obviously the most important thing, all the people who've died and been injured and who've been forced from their homes, but also has been politically disastrous. And I think actually potentially disastrous also for the careers of top Biden administration officials themselves. Politically disastrous because Joe Biden now is in a situation as we enter into this kind of the meat of the presidential campaign in which he literally can't go speak to his own party's base. He can't go speak at a university. He can't go speak at a Black church. He can't even go speak at a union event without the very real prospect of his speech being protested, even interrupted, because there's so much anger at his policy on Gaza. It's one thing not to have a hugely enthusiastic voter base, as Biden, never really has had a hugely enthusiastic support from his party's base. But to not be able to, but to have people be so angry at you and your own party's base that you can't go to the institutions of your own party's base without literally having people protest you. That's a huge warning sign for a presidential campaign. Yes, it would have been very challenging for Biden to take politically to take a different line on the Gaza war as well. But it doesn't seem to me that they recognized early on how bad politically, how dangerous this path they were on was. And secondly, I don't get the sense that people in the Biden administration, the foreign policy team, understand the potential ramifications for their careers over this. I mean, there has been a pattern that if you leave a foreign administration, you can go to work on Wall Street, you can be a consultant, but oftentimes people also go to universities. They become deans of colleges at universities. They teach at universities. This is a kind of an enjoyable thing for folks to do in the few years while they wait for their party to regain power. This is what people did after the Clinton administration, after the Obama administration. I think we're in a very different world now. I think if you are a top Biden foreign policy official and think that you can go for a couple of pleasant years to some leafy university campus and teach a couple classes and hang out for a while, I think you're sorely mistaken. I think the experience of a Biden official who was involved in this war going to a university in the coming years would be not that different than the experience that people like George Bundy and Walt Rostow experienced when they tried to go back to the universities that they had been on in before the Vietnam War. These people are going to be treated with a lot of anger for what they've done. And so I think about why it was that the administration took this path. And this is my theory. My theory is that if you work in Washington foreign policy for a long period of time, your you become more and more divorced from how ordinary progressive minded people think about the world, especially on Israel Palestine. And the reason you become divorced from them is that when people in Washington talk and work in Washington foreign policy, they always have to think in terms of the constraints of what's politically possible. I used to work at Washington think tanks. I used to spend a lot of time with people who came in and out of Democratic foreign policy jobs. And one of the things that always struck me was that even in relatively private settings, when people would talk about policy, they would always adopt the framework of what is politically possible, what was politically saleable, could be sold in their view politically. And they just were not generally interested in thinking outside of those terms. Because if you talk in terms of policy ideas or moral perspectives that are outside of the bounds of what's considered politically possible, you kind of make yourself irrelevant. I think that's the kind of the idea in Washington. You become someone who's not really useful, who's actually a kind of pain in the neck to have around, right? Because the last thing that a politician wants is to be told to do something that basically is politically they don't feel like they can do. So people adopt these really narrowing constraints in terms of how they talk about policy in general, but especially on Israel-Palestine, because that's the foreign policy issue on which the political pressures are the greatest. And so what I noticed was that even to make moral arguments about what Israel was doing to the Palestinians and to suggest that there should be consequences for those moral decisions was often essentially to speak outside of the political constraints that people were interested in talking about, that essentially people almost like shut off that entire conversation, almost like shut off that entire part of their brain. I think these were people who, had they gone in a different course in life, would have understood that what America was helping Israel do towards Palestinians was deeply immoral. But they recognized that if they were to adopt that perspective, let alone vocalize it within Washington, it would be very injurious to their careers. I mean, imagine you're a junior or mid-level foreign policy official in a Democratic administration, and you go on record, you're heard to say that 5 years ago that you think that America should condition military aid, or there should be international legal consequences for what Israel's doing. That would be a good way of basically ending your career in government. And so I think what happens is that people essentially over time, they shut that part of their brain off, the part of their brain that might have a kind of a moral revulsion at what Israel is doing to Palestinians and what America is helping Israel do to Palestinians. And if you do that long enough, I think you can come to forget that ordinary people out there in the country, ordinary progressive-minded people, who are seeing these horrifying images day after day of what's happening to people in Gaza, that they don't do that. They don't kind of sublimate these instincts. They just respond in a much more kind of natural, intuitive way. Like, why are we doing this? This is completely contrary to my values. Why are my taxpayers' dollars used to being fund this? And I think what's happened in Washington is that Democrats, over time, as Democrats in the foreign policy kind of establishment, basically turn off that part of their brain in order to succeed and start to make their way up the ranks within foreign policy in Washington. And if you do that long enough, I think it makes it harder for you to predict that that's how ordinary Americans, progressive Americans, would respond to the war in Gaza. So I think that may be why people in the Biden administration were slow to recognize that this issue of Gaza was becoming really, really important to progressives in America, that a progressive in America would be revolted by what they were seeing, because I think the people in the Biden administration themselves had over time undergone a process in which they didn't allow themselves to have those same human responses because they were within a political environment in which it would have been very counterproductive for them to do that. And that helps to explain this disconnect between the Biden administration and the progressive base of the Democratic Party that I think now represents a threat to Biden's reelection campaigns. And I also think it is something that will dog people in the Biden administration for years to come.